This camera is right in the way of my line of sight.
We're ready to go.
Yeah, so we're happy to proceed.
Peter Fraser.
Okay, thank you.
Ina hau kāinga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ina rangatira, ka mihi kia koutou I tēnei wā. I'm very aware that this is the session after lunch. This is known as the graveyard shift.
Or the sleep.
We were very well looked after at lunchtime, and I made sure I only had one cup because otherwise I'd be falling asleep as well. So I'm very determined, to keep the time. My name's Peter Fraser. I'm here to provide expert economic evidence to assist this process and to assist the panel of commissioners in the decisions that you need to make. I'm going to take the evidence that have been submitted by myself as read, because I think we've got better things to do after lunch than for me to read that. What I do want to refer you to, though, is paragraphs 11 and paragraph 13, and that just outlines the scope of what my evidence is for this afternoon. And that's, I'll use my hands because it's better than reading it. And as an economist, I work on visual things rather than written things. So the argument goes something like this. If the rivers, which are currently a bit too low, are going to have more water in them, then it means there's going to be less water in a Te Mana o Te Wai framework for Tier 3. And that includes commercial users, industrial users, and irrigators. Now, if there is less water available for irrigators, then economic activity measured by GDP or other measurements will fall. At a regional level, that will then result in fewer employment opportunities. And bringing it home to the whole kāinga here at Bridge Pa, that means an already deprived community is potentially made worse off. So therefore, if we go back to the original thing, the best thing for the whole kāinga in places such as here as Bridge Pa is that the water doesn't go back into the rivers and it stays with the irrigators and we keep the status quo. So my role here to do in terms of expert economic advice is to tell you in no uncertain terms that that is rubbish. I'm going to cover 5 areas in my presentation. First thing I want to do is cover the economic analysis which the Regional Council has had done by Market Economics. This is the 2018 Economic Impact paper. No doubt you've read it. It's a thrilling read. It's a great bedtime story. The second thing...
We treat all reports and evidence equally in the first instance.
I'm from Wellington, so I'm pretty sure Peter Jackson is queuing up for the movie rights for that, because I'm pretty sure that he could make this report into at least a 4-hour movie. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of economic analysis and decision-making in a public policy context is the importance of a robust cost-benefit analysis for decision-making. So that's the second point I want to talk about. The third area I want to look at is Dr. Cole's report. That is the voluminous series of slides, which is the social impact assessment. That is a document that I understand Hawke's Bay Regional Council have used in terms of their Section 42A assessment, and part of their rationale that the impact on Māori will be such that the status quo needs to prevail. Next, I want to talk about efficiency issues, because efficiency issues are something that economists feel we can talk on with some confidence. I then also want to talk about some issues regarding equity. And then I want to look at how the two interface with each other. And finally, I want to talk about the issue of time and pick up on Count Sell's point this morning about boldness, about the need to do things that, as an economist, time is money, but also time equals option value and opportunity value, and it's opportunity value foregone. So I'm not here to sort of say you need to think about a 2-year time frame or a 10-year time frame or a 3-generation time frame. That's not my role. What my role is to give you what are the implications from economics when we think about time. So those are the 5 points I want to talk about. I want to start with market economics. I'm very used to economists from one side sitting there and moaning in increasingly pedantic ways about the work of their colleagues. And it'll be arcane stories about parameters and which model did you use and blah, 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 blah. And it really doesn't get us very far. What I will say is I think this is quite a good report. I'm happy to go on record and say it's quite a good report. What I want to do is qualify that in 2 ways. Firstly, I want to look at covering what they have covered, but then what I want to do is look at what they haven't covered. Now, I want to preface that with what the authors themselves have said. Now, I've not got this to go up on the flash screen, so the reference is the first line on page 20, Recommendations, section 4. And I'll just read the first line. This study represents a first attempt to assess the regional and national level economic consequences associated with the proposed policy options in the tank catchment. Full stop. First point I want to make is that this report predates PC9. So it's a little bit like one of those cooking shows. You know, the one that says, I've just prepared this before and I'll bring it out now. So look, this is not a bad report, but it's not specifically prepared for PC9. Critically, it's not been updated for PC9, and that would have been a relatively easy thing to do. So as the authors themselves say, this is a first attempt. What I note as an economist from Hawke's Bay Regional Council, this is not only their first attempt, it appears to be their only attempt. And that was 3 years ago. So there has been time for some updating, and that updating has not happened. When we look at what the report has done, they use a process called input-output analysis. And again, I don't want to go into the methodology of different approaches because I don't think it really makes a big deal. What I will say, though, is that the authors give a very nuanced commentary between different economic processes. In particular, they talk about the pros of input-output analysis and the pros of CGE. My personal preference is CGE. It's a much better process. To put it into simple terms, because I don't want to bore you with the minutiae of economics, what input-output is good for, and the authors actually phrase it quite well, is if you put a shock into the economy, how does that ripple through the economy like throwing a stone in the lake and a ripple will go across the lake? So it does that, and it does that very well. But what you really want to know is what are all the feedback loops? Because in an economy, nothing's free. So even if something can't be used for one use, it gets reused for an alternative use. And CGE will do that. There are no free lunches with CG. So there are free lunches with IO. So cutting right to the chase, what does that mean to you as commissioners when interpreting this report? Well, what it means is that the figures they come up with, which again have been well caveated, so I don't have a problem with that, they, in my view, are a worst case scenario. So if you look at the worst case of the worst case scenario, they come up with a number of about $1.4 billion. That sounds like an awful amount of money. In Bridge Par, that is an awful amount of money. But let's put that into context. This is the context. Hawke's Bay has a regional GDP of $9 billion per annum, in a nation that has a GDP in New Zealand dollars of approximately $290 billion. So $1.4 billion in $9 billion, that's a big number. It's about 16%. But that's not the way you interpret it. The $1.4 billion is not over 1 year, not over 2 years, not over 5 years, not over 10 years, it's not over 20 years. It's the cost over 30 years. So when you put 1.4 billion cost over 30 years, that doesn't sound quite so scary. And that's the context that's really important. Because there will be winners and there will be losers, and the people associated with the $1.4 billion have got 1.4 billion reasons to be very unhappy about that, and I totally get that. But this is where this report, the authors are quite correct to say that it's only a first stage. Because I now want to move on to what they haven't done. And I'm reading again from page 20 in their recommendations. What they say is, we've not modelled any impacts of alternative farm systems. So basically, if something falls over, it stays fallen over. I'll give you a very simple example from my rohe, which is on the other side of the Ruahine Ranges, and is in the Rangitike. It's less than a generation ago, we got money from the government to put in more sheep, because the sheep had there's no diminishing marginal utility with sheep. More sheep were good sheep. And so we were flat out, because we also had work schemes, to clear all this goddamn manuka off the hillsides to put more sheep there. What we've just got is funding from the government. The sheep have long gone, because there's no money in them. And we're now putting in manuka. So land use change is real. My father, as a child, used to take us up here for holidays. And I can remember coming in on the onga-ongas on the back of a brown HQ Holden, which had no air conditioning, by the way, and in the middle of summer on plastic seats had the approximate temperature inside of 4 million degrees. And my father hated the windows open because it hurt his ears. And I can remember coming along onga-onga, and there were, at that time, sheep everywhere. I drove in here this morning, and it's covered in grapes. So I think the point to remember is that people, they have initiative. Things change. Things change quite quickly. The grapes look like they've been there forever. I'm telling you now, they haven't been. The sheep look like they've been there forever. They're gone. They're history. So things change and can change very, very quickly. The next thing they pick up is they say, we've not talked about alternative transition pathways, and we think that that could make quite a big difference. Well, no shit, Sherlock. That does make quite a big difference. So maybe you should think about it. But the final one I want to pick up is cost-benefit analysis, because this is my segue into point number 2, where I talk about cost-benefit analysis. I'll just again read 2 lines, and I'll do the complete sentences so I've not truncated them and sort of misrepresented the authors. But this is what it says, cost-benefit analysis. It is recommended that the economic costs associated with the regional and national level impact assessment be presented alongside the wider societal, environmental and cultural benefits that the policy options provide. Economic impact assessment is usually only a component of a wider cost-benefit analysis. or as per the Treasury guidelines, part of the Better Business Case framework. Full stop. So to be, as I said, to be fair to the authors, they've written a good report. If this was baseball, they've gotten us to base one. It cannot be interpreted any more than that. I now want to move on to the importance of cost-benefit analysis, because what this has done is it's basically outlined costs with no benefits. So cost with no benefits not only sounds really expensive, notwithstanding $1.4 billion in 30 years discounted at 8%, but it actually sounds quite scary because you're losing all the stuff. What are we actually getting? What I've found in reading these reports has been a real fixation on jobs, and that's understandable. In a catchment or in a community with 40% of the population, and I'm referring to Dr. Cole's papers here, that are on benefit or benefit-dependent households, jobs are a really important story. I totally get that. But from an economic perspective, it's much more nuanced than more jobs good, fewer jobs bad. And the reason I say, and the example I want to bring is the cost-benefit analysis that was done by Butcher Associates for the Ruataniwha Dam that was commissioned by Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Like this report, it used the Treasury discount rate of 8%. At 8%, under all scenarios, the Ruataniwha Dam had a negative NPV. The middle scenario this was a $600 million project that had, under the middle scenario, a negative NPV of 27 million, a worst case of 67 million, and a best case of negative 10 million. Yet it produced 3,500 FTE equivalent jobs over the region. So if we'd have just turned up and said, I've got a proposal that's got 3,500 jobs, people would say, fantastic, let's do it. Why haven't we done it? Sounds like a no-brainer. Who would not want 3,500 jobs? Where the economic analysis was really important is it said that those 3,500 jobs actually created, look, it's not that they created no value, is that once you put them, the costs and the benefits together, and you then appropriately discounted both. And I want to emphasise here, this was the report that was commissioned by Hawke's Bay Regional Council, who were actually proposing the scheme. So if there was any question of it favouring one side or the other, the assumption I made was it would favour the scheme. But even with the wind behind them, they couldn't make it work. So I'm not here to relitigate Ruataniwha. What I am using Ruataniwha as a really good example of why you need a robust cost-benefit analysis when making decisions like this. Because what intuitively may seem no-brainer, 3,500 jobs good, other jobs bad, may not actually be the case. I want to just pause for a moment and just pull back to the market economics, because I've just looked at my notes here and I realise I've just missed an issue, so I want to pick that up before I proceed to the next issue. So I just want to go back for a minute. It comes back to the issue around, if you've got a $9 billion economy, and let's say you've got a trend growth rate of 3% per annum, then it means your economy is doubling every 24 years. Now, again, there is and that's just a simple mathematical relationship. Now, there's a question is, can you environmentally sustain that? Is that a sensible thing to do? Look, they're all very, very valid questions. But even if we just for the purposes of just a thought experiment and said, $9 billion, let's say there's no growth for the next 30 years. So it's just $9 billion going into the future. So we then discount that back down to whatever the appropriate figure is. And I was trying to get the formula off my calculator, off my phone this morning, and my calculator wouldn't do it. So I can't give you a precise number, but I can if you want to later. But it's the thinking behind it rather than the number itself. So you'll get a very big number that then gets discounted down into a present value number, which is smaller. I'd sort of put to you that the 1.4 over that number would not only be very, very small, but likely to be within the margin of error of the model. Now, I'm being very careful here because I've not participated in the modelling. I've not been able to peer review it. This is where the technical things about the parameters they've used and the assumptions I don't know. So I'm giving very much giving the authors here the benefit of the doubt. But what I'm saying is that when they've come up with a figure discounted at 1.4, there will be an error margin within this model. And what I'd be interested to see is what that error margin is, because my guess is the figures they've got there would be within the margin of error. If they're within the margin of error, then it means they're indistinguishable from zero. So what that means is that on a good day, I wouldn't be putting a lot of emphasis on this report. If you want to have economic analysis, and I desperately think that you do need it, you need to get some more. I now want to move on to Dr. Cole's report, the 150 odd slides. I've just run the assumption because, to be quite honest, I don't think my colleagues here have the budget for me to check 150 slides, and I'm not sure it would be a particularly good use of my time. I've just assumed it's fine. So if the report says that 60% of the people are aged something or other in Clive, I've just assumed it is. So I've just taken that all as face value. I think the first point that Dr. Cole makes is actually a very fair one, is that he outlines some of the well-known and well-accepted limitations of GDP as a measure when you're looking at either human welfare or human well-being. And I think those points are fairly made. And I think they're well accepted across the economic fraternity. So I don't have any sort of great concern with that. What I would say, though, is that what he's put together is not an economic assessment. He's made some very good points in there, but it's not an economic assessment. So I think to draw economic analysis out of something that's not an economic assessment is at best fraught and at worst unprofessional. You end up with something like an argument, well, you know, a wild assertion masquerading as an argument. There's just not the basis in there in terms of economic analysis to draw those sort of conclusions, which seem to be used by the council in their Section 42A analysis. It's just not there. Now, what is there in Mr. Cole's analysis from a tikanga Māori perspective, and again, I'm being very careful here because I'm right at the limits of my expert advice, because I'm here to give you expert advice as an economist, not as an expert in mataranga Māori or tikanga Māori. Notwithstanding the fact that I am Māori and I've got views on that, I'm being quite siloed and being quite careful in the evidence that I give. So the way that I see this as an economist is that different people, they will make different decisions and they'll have preferences. And suddenly, as soon as I put this into the context of a preference, as an economist, I can suddenly think about it because we have a way of thinking about preferences. So whether that preference is, for example, what Mr. Smith was saying about not mixing different types of water because you've got a belief and that's based on tapu and noa and that sort of thing. I don't need to know about tapu and noa. I just need to know that you like this one rather than that one. As an economist, that's pretty much all I need to know. What I do get very strongly from Dr. Cole's evidence is the inability to really separate cultural well-being from economic development. They're at best the flip sides of the same coin. They're not two separate activities. And so this also avoids the false dichotomy that Count Sell mentioned earlier today about Māori always seeming to be portrayed as environmentalists. Yes, Māori are environmentalists. There's a preference around the environment, and a very strong one. There's also a preference around living standards and feeding whānau and being able to participate in cultural activities. And that requires economic activity. So this is a case of and, not or. So where I come to with my mistake, Dr. Cole's paper, is fair points about the weaknesses of GDP. To be honest, I don't think Dr. Cole draws an economic argument out of his paper. If he has, well, I don't think he has, but I don't think there's an economic argument that can be legitimately drawn out of that paper because it's not an economics paper. So I think where this leads us is that the Council's conclusion in their Section 42A analysis, and goes back to my original thing that if to get the water back in the river, the water's got to come from here, and that means less economic activity, so that means less jobs, and that means good bridge power and all of that sort of stuff. All of that argument suddenly starts to fall over because it has no evidential base to it. And not only does it have any evidential base, all of those steps require what economists call a transmission mechanism. Now, a transmission mechanism is just simply what joins you from this to this to this to this. So just to use jobs as the example, I mean, a very easy thing would have been is if we jump back 30 years ago and we had the huge freezing works up here, and they'd employ, at the peak of the season, 2,500, 3,000 people. And the vast majority of them were Māori. I know because I'm related to them. Now, when they shut down, the economic impact was immediate and direct and unquestioned. Now, for the sort of arguments the council have hinted at, we need a similar linkage. So if it was a case that, and I'll use shearing as an example, even though that's a dying industry, let's say we had a certain amount of Māori shearing gangs. Because again, I've got cousins that bought houses out of shearing back in the day. And let's say that sheep went, shearers go. But if we're talking about picking fruit, then my understanding is most of the fruit picked is in a normal season picked by RSE workers. So if the full-time equivalent jobs that are going is effectively someone from Vanuatu, and to be honest, I feel really sorry for the people from Vanuatu. This is not a win for them either. But to then argue that somehow there are fewer jobs for Māori when Māori never had them in the first place, not a very good argument. I mean, it's back to my assertion masquerading as an argument without any evidence, because there's no transmission mechanisms. I now want to move on to efficiency and equity issues. Now, the problem we have here, and I'll go back to the original thing I said about the water in the river not being there and the water over here being there. So in Te Mana o Te Wai terms, what it basically means, there's not enough Tier 1 water, there's too much going to Tier 3, so some of that Tier 3 water needs to go back to Tier 1. It's that simple. Now, the actual amount of it is beyond my level of expertise. We've heard evidence from my colleagues here about figures that they think would be a sustainable amount for the aquifer and that sort of thing, and I've no comment on that. What I am saying, though, is that my reading of Te Mana o Te Wai is basically now is good. And Council outlined the timings this morning, and it said now. Now, if it's 2024, I want to give an example of my late grandfather, who was in the Pioneer Māori Battalion. He joined at the outset of World War I. My grandfather and his colleagues managed to go overseas, fight World War I, knock over the Kaiser, and win, and come home in less time than it takes this council to do a plan change. I don't think my karaua would be very impressed with that, because I don't think it's good enough. Anyway, that's what I think. I now want to go down to the efficiency issues. What you effectively have is a problem of, in an economics term, of an exogenous shock. Is that you have to take resources from this area and put them over here. Now, the golden standard of any sort of economic analysis when it comes to efficiency is Pareto efficiency. And what that means is that you can change an allocation in such a way that it makes at least one person better off and nobody worse off. Another way of thinking of it, it's a do no harm principle. Now, that's the theoretical optimum. Now, the reality in public policy is that almost never eventuates. Because unfortunately, if you're taking resources from one area and putting to another area, you do impose economic harm, someone is made worse off. So the question is, how do you minimise the harm? Now, welfare economics has a concept called the Caldor Hicks compensation test. And this is effectively the thinking that sits behind cost-benefit analysis. It came out of a different intellectual stream, but it ends up in the same place, which is how I circle back to cost-benefit analysis. What it basically says is that could the beneficiaries of this new allocation, in theory, compensate the people that lost from this allocation, and there still be a positive residual? In other words, are the benefits greater than the costs? That's the gist of it. So what the council really needs to be doing from an economic policy perspective is not trying to sustain the status quo through some rather tenuous arguments to protect Māori, or by, because let's be also quite blunt here. What my colleagues have outlined this afternoon is that what we have in economics terms is a demand side problem. There's excess demand. So the first best solution to resolving excess demand is reducing the excess demand so that there's not excess demand. The optimal solution is not to take water from somewhere else and cure a demand-side problem with a supply-side solution. So, what in my view, from an economic public policy perspective, the council needs to be thinking about is how do we do a transition that minimises economic harm imposed of the transition? And again, there's there's lots of ways that you can do that, and I won't go into the nuts and bolts of how you do that, but the critical thing you're looking at is a process of really least cost abatement. Because it's another way of thinking about it is it's like the analogy with low-hanging fruit. You don't get a ladder and go right to the top of a tree and get the hardest piece of fruit. You get the lowest hanging fruit first. And this is where there is plenty of examples in economic literature, sulfur dioxide being the absolute textbook example of, in that situation, they had a problem of acid rain that was coming out of US steel factories because they burnt coal to make steel, or coke actually, to make steel, and that turned into acid rain. So what they effectively did is allocated permits, and they allowed trading amongst the companies. So what you found was that the least efficient plants closed down. They sold their permits to the more efficient plants, which is a nice segue into efficiency. The RMA, when it comes to the allocation of water, is a complete disaster when it comes to efficiency. It's a disaster in two ways. Firstly, with a first in, first served, there is no guarantee that the initial allocation is actually to the most efficient users or the highest value users. I mean, it's just whoever turned up first and got it. Then that's the initial problem. Then we get a dynamic efficiency problem. The dynamic efficiency problem is that once I've got it, I therefore want to keep it. And what we then do is we then lock that inefficiency in, whether that be through grandparenting type clauses, whether that be through renewals, whether that be through, well, I'm going to go broke and I'm going to cut down my apple trees, that sort of argument. So what you do is you started off with an inefficient allocation of water, you then perpetuate it. But there's a second issue in here, which is an efficiency issue. Now, this is the efficiency issue, is that in many cases, Māori have missed out when it comes to first in, first served. Niall this morning mentioned the Waitangi Tribunal case Y2358. And I'm
just going to pause you there, Mr. Smith. I think this is a bit of preaching to the converted. Many of the panel members are quite aware of the issues of the RM system in regards to the allocation of water and the legacy of pre-RMA and post-RMA allocation issues. So I don't think you need to dwell there. I know we've got past number 3, and you've got 5 points. You're into 4.
We're in 4.
And I'd like you to conclude quite quickly because we may have some questions, but I don't want to shorten our last speaker because I know we certainly do have some questions for the planner.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, just rounding that off. What I'm saying is that you lock in something that's, the risk here is locking in something that's not only inefficient, it's also inequitable, and at the same time you've missed out, there's an opportunity cost here about what would have been the other thing that would have happened if that water had been allocated in a different way. So that's how we then get back to an efficiency issue. The final thing I want to talk about is time. And this comes out of a piece of work I've recently done for an iwi that's towards the back end of the Waitangi Tribunal process. And cutting a story very short, what they are saying is effectively through no fault of their own, they've lost a generation of opportunity waiting for the process. So the broader point I'm making in this context is that when we talk about transitions, the focus normally goes on, in the example I used about the Tier 3 water going back into the river as Tier 1 water, we talk about the people that lose the water. What we don't talk about the people that actually benefit from it going back into the rivers. And this is where I want to circle back to my original point, which is why a cost-benefit analysis that covers exactly those points is so vitally important when making these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Do we have any questions? It doesn't look like we've got any questions.
Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. We've got our last speaker.
Second to last.
Second last speaker.
Ngahi is.
Oh, no, he was.
So, hand over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've heard from me already, so I won't, and my qualifications and everything are set out in my evidence. Just ngā mihi nui to the commissioners, the council, tangata whenua, mana whenua, and Ngāti Kahungunu in particular for having me here today. I come from Frasertown in northern Hawke's Bay. Via Vermont originally, but I came to Aotearoa, New Zealand when I was 21 to study planning and stayed here. So that's how I end up in front of you today. Given that, Commissioners, you have my primary statement of evidence, you have my summary from this morning as well, and we have traversed a number of issues already as well by way of questions. I wonder if it may be most helpful to you, and I will be led by you on this, for me to actually jump straight to some of the allocation questions and actually the issues that Mr. Fraser was just talking about and what is being proposed within the track changes version of the plan that I supplied to you in my primary statement of evidence. Or would you like more of a summary
That's
first?
fine, because we've received your summary. Thank you
Yep.
very much. And I'll just have a look to see. I've had a read of it. Has everyone else had a read of the summary? We have. Yes. Yep, we've got little marks on them as well. So we've read your summary of evidence. So maybe we'll do that and go straight to the
Sure. So probably just
Thank you.
to and you have you would have seen then my more fulsome correction, I suppose, to the 42A addendum in terms of the comments around objective
Yes.
42 and the importance there that I'll just emphasise that provisions can't be deleted out of Chapter 5 of the RRMP without those equivalent provisions, particularly the no degradation bottom line, without those equivalent provisions being put into PPC 9. So the track changes version that you have in front of you with my evidence, we deal, there are 5 kind of key, I guess, aspects to that, including new provisions to directly address the values and aspirations of tangata whenua within the tank catchments, revision of the allocation regime for water takes such that a review occurs within 5 years of the plan becoming operative, and I'll dive into that very shortly. Removal of the reliance on stream flow enhancement as a means of mitigating over-allocation, a requirement for freshwater farm plans as a mandatory requirement, and various changes that also improve the clarity and mechanics of the plan. So to speak to the allocation changes, and I guess the hard limits that have been spoken of, and the 70 million versus the 90 million limit, as I know the commissioners will be thinking about how to, if they were contemplating a lower limit, how that might be achieved and what a alternative allocation regime could look like. As I spoke about earlier, my assessment of the plan is that it essentially enables the status quo to continue based on actual and reasonable use at the moment, and defers a reconsideration of the allocation regime to the 10-year time frame when the plan would be renewed anyway under the existing RMA anyway. So in the track changes version, you'll see in particular policies 36 and 37, where I've suggested that that's where we include an interim limit of 70 rather than 90 million cubic meters per year for groundwater quantity this is. And we do enable those existing consents.
Should we put up on the screen, I think? Just wondering, Mr. Chair, if we should put it up on the screen whether it's...
Yeah, that might be helpful actually,
Yeah,
because I'm
sorry.
just trying
Have you
to,
got
as you're
the copy
talking,
there?
I'm trying to find it. Yeah.
It's the document we were looking at earlier,
Which
the
one you got?
appendix.
Apologies if I'm rushing,
Wilson.
conscious of time.
I'm in the wrong appendix, that's why.
The track changes.
Yeah. Appendix 1, it should be listed as. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it, thank you.
Yeah, you're right there.
You're
Don't
right
go.
there.
Don't go too far. 37. Thanks. Sure. So what policy 36 is about is committing to a 5-year time frame rather than a 10-year to figure out essentially a new allocation regime, and then policy 37 is to enable those renewals that are now provided for in the rules of the plan, so renewals of existing takes, to occur, but that they have to be managed within that 70 million limit, and that there does have to be a clawback on those existing takes. So that's how we get to that lower level. Now, I think there's work to be done, and potentially in terms of the refinement of those numbers. That number that I've suggested around the 12.5% comes from the submission of.
You scroll up to Roman 3.
Yeah, thank you. Comes from the submission of Tita Whenua o Herotanga. And I'll make the comment that this in particular were provisions that I had, I guess, anticipated and hoped probably that we would get some substantive reply from officers. This was the first time that this had been seen as such, and I think that would have been helpful possibly in terms of refining those. Again, as I've stated in my evidence that, and explained in my evidence, the approach I've taken is to try to articulate and put into plan provisions all of the points that Ngāti Kahungunu Incorporated has been communicating through the tank process for a number of years, and has been communicating, in its pre-notification submission as well as its formal submission and its further submissions and in evidence that we've heard today. So I guess I'm saying that these aren't necessarily perfect provisions, but I have tried to undertake quite an extensive drafting exercise to give words to what is being asked for in this submission. I can probably leave it there really and just open to questions given time constraints, but I'm also happy to be guided by you, Mr. Chair, in that regard.
I guess my difficulty with suddenly imposing 70 million cubic metres is how would you envisage that would be implemented? That's a 22% decrease in the amount of water available to communities who would be hotly opposed to that, and I suspect the Napier Hastings, it's unrealistic to have that sort of reduction. So we're talking about reductions to water users within the rural community, probably in the order of 30%. How do you envisage that would happen?
By those clawbacks, and I think that, the reality and the starting point for these is not to go from the 90 million is not the water available. The 90 million is the water that is being taken. And so this, to draw from Mr. Fraser's evidence, this approach is about, I guess, flipping the management strategy to one that looks at supply rather than demand. And I think there's enough uncertainty within that 90 million already, we've talked about that this morning, that I think that, and Mr. Fraser's spoken to it as well, that yes, it's not easy, and I don't pretend that there won't be a pushback to that, but the intention is to change behaviors, because we are experiencing in these catchments, there are significant environmental and cultural adverse effects happening, and that is in fact the intention, is to change those behaviors.
Wouldn't it be more appropriate to take a sinking lid approach? In other words, a phased reduction rather than saying suddenly this is the amount available and you're all going to be losing 20 or 30% of your water, to a sinking lid over a 10, 20, 30 year period where the reduction is phased, so people are able to gear themselves up for what's coming in the future gradually.
Yeah, my understanding through the tank process is that was traversed quite extensively, the sinking lid approach, and over a longer time frame. And I think that my understanding of the plan as drafted is that the idea is that there will be some revisit to the allocation regime within the life of the plan. My problem with the plan as drafted is that there is no certainty as to how that will happen, what numbers will be used, and I think given the evidence that we've had in the last couple of days, that simply doesn't adequately address the concerns that we're hearing from Tangata Whenua in particular. So I guess there could be opportunity for that, but it needs to be defined and included within the plan.
Sure.
As to how that will happen. My assessment of the objectives and policies too is that there isn't a real tangible commitment to the phasing out of over-allocation. There is a statement that it will occur, but there is no pathway by which it will occur.
So whatever the case in terms of whatever number is in there, if it's less than, say, the existing allocation, you need some sort of methods of implementation for how that would be put in place, because it would need to be treat issues of equity, treat the issue around public water supply being given a higher status than other users. It would need to address the practicalities of when consents expire and common catchment expiry dates, and I know that's in one of the schedules, but it would be a very how can I put it? It would have to be an elaborately constructed approach in order to bring in a regime like that. Do you broadly agree?
Yes and no. I've traversed all those issues within my primary evidence, and I've written policies within this track changes version that, my view is that the approach is firstly that, and we use Te Mana o Te Wai as our direction, and that we actually have that framework there for us, exactly as you've said. We can now, I think we can, within this plan, we can have policies that commit to a core allocation for the water bodies themselves, commit to a tangata whenua allocation, commit to the primacy of community water supplies, and then those other uses come after. So we can actually use that hierarchy very clearly and articulate that through policies within this plan.
I don't think we can commit to flows and water bodies simply because the climate's changing too much. We might be setting targets, if you like, that are just not going to be achieved if the East Coast continues to get drier.
My response to that would be also that we surely should not be committing to providing existing users with the same amounts of water that they've been taking and grandparenting the existing consents.
Yeah, I well understand
that has to be dealt with as an overall package.
What I'm more concerned about is setting target flows in stream in the way that you were envisaging. Obviously there are significant problems, particularly in this area with stream beds that are dry, very dry, and something needs to be done about that. It's a matter of an equitable and an approach that gets phased in rather than, I guess, a sudden kick, if you like.
I'm not sure I agree. I think we, drawing again from Mr. Fraser's evidence, I think that the kick is already being felt by the communities that are experiencing those effects. I think, my view, and again, I do traverse this in my evidence, my view is that the kick, if you will, to existing consent holders is overstated. I think that my experience has been with all kinds of plan provisions and changes to consent conditions and whatnot, that the actual cost to consent holders when we increase regulation or change a framework is often very much overstated at the beginning, and Mr. Fraser spoke to that. We are trying to and need to influence behavior within these catchments in terms of water use, and if that results in people changing the way they use land, that it can only be a good thing. So I'm not sure that an equitable approach looks like phasing out that over abstraction slowly in order to then slowly get the benefits. I think it needs to be reversed, and that we actually need to do that quickly so that we can get those benefits and balance things out as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
I've been trying to get my head around how Schedule 26 works in the plan, and I'm trying to get my head around the rule cascade and the relationship between those rules and Schedule 26. And please help me out here if you can, my understanding is that the water quality objectives and targets in Schedule 20, and this is the updated Schedule 26 from the officer's report, kicks in when certain rules require development of catchment collectives and freshwater farm environment plans, and they have to take into account the Schedule 26 water quality objectives and targets. Is there any other mechanisms in the plan that that requires reference to, or reference to Schedule 26?
Not in the rules, no, that's my understanding. So and we'll note too that the use of production land is, as proposed, a permitted activity, provided you either do a farm environment plan or a part of a catchment collective. So in my track changes, I've suggested that it needs to be at least a controlled activity, but also that those catchment collectives shouldn't be relied on, and that the tool is actually the farm environment management plans through a consent process. There are policies around the catchment collectives, around Schedule 26 in terms of those as targets to be met, but you'll see I've tried to deal with the cascade, if you will, within my primary evidence, and my assessment of how the plan would work in practice is that no, that Schedule 26 is only brought in by those, by the catchment collective approach.
And in that respect, while the limits, or I'm calling them limits, the targets and objectives, they're numbers, they're hard numbers, if you like. But is there any actual requirement within the rural framework to meet those targets or objectives?
No.
The answer is yes. If you look at the council's latest version, Schedule 26 is explicitly referred to in terms of the stormwater discharge rules.
Sorry, my apologies. Yep.
So
I'm thinking about more broadly as land use activities. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, the questions
Sorry.
I've been asking are in relation to those first 5 or 6
Sorry, yeah,
rules.
I should have clarified. The focus for Ngāti Kahanunu has very much been on we've kind of parked some of the stormwater provisions. Those were subject to a different working group within the tank process, and are some of the more robust, in my view, provisions within the plan, as are the source protection zone provisions. So sorry, I was looking at it through the lens of the productive land uses and those rules.
And I'm just trying to find, you've recommended, I think, Objective 16
Yes.
is removed and replaced by 16A and 16B.
Yes.
I'm just trying to find. This question with respect to 16A is, what do you mean by natural flow? Do you mean the naturalised flow? Right. And secondly, in relation to 16B, maintain existing groundwater quantity, including level and flows in the aquifers. How is it by maintaining existing groundwater levels, are you achieving what your client's looking to achieve in terms of surface flows, spring flows, etc.?
Yes. I think, good point. I think that could be changed to better align with the Objective 3A around so there should be provision for improve, I guess, or increase. Yep.
Enhance.
Yep.
Just in terms of your 16A, I'd note it's actually quite difficult in the Ahuriri because a lot of the discharge, quite a bit of the catchment is stormwater from Napier City, so we don't want to really enhance that.
Sorry, Commissioner, we can't hear your question.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. In the Ahuriri, a lot of the water that goes into it is actually stormwater from Napier City, so you wouldn't want to restore at least 70% of the stormwater. There are rules that control the stormwater discharges in the future that do refer back to Schedule 26. But I know there's a small natural catchment as well, but quite a bit of it is Napier City in that regard.
Okay, noted.
Can I just be clear about what you've got in here? So you've cut out a tank objective 1.
Yes.
And then tank objective 2, the words that were in the original plan change are there, and the words in purple are your suggested changes.
That's correct. And with objective tank 1, where it is green, sorry about the colours, that objective to me is a policy, so that you'll find that later in the policy sections and subject to some revision. So I have really tried to, I guess, anytime you start tinkering with a plan, there are flow-on effects, and so I've tried to present a package that all flows together, and I've tried to I guess explain that and provide that commentary within my primary evidence statement. So hopefully if you kind of read that statement alongside looking through those track changes, it should hopefully make sense as to what changes are made and why and what the rationale behind that was.
With the overall approach being an objective should state an outcome, and a policy should be explain the way in which it'll be implemented.
That's
and
right.
Then the rules and methods, etc., elaborate on the policies effectively.
That's right. And so again, I guess my goal, if you will, in doing this essentially drafting exercise was twofold. And my primary goal obviously was to again articulate the submissions of Ngāti Kahanunui we incorporated and provide you with those provisions. But it was also to my initial assessment when I first looked at the tank plan change in when a draft was available, I believe it was 2018. Was that there was, and I know other submitters have raised this, and I think you'll probably get more evidence about that next week as well, that some of the objectives seemed more to be better suited as policies, and that there were policies that are better suited as methods and whatnot. So as I've gone through, I have also tried to, I guess, make some of those improvements for certainty and clarity and the mechanics of the plan, wherever I think there's an opportunity to do that.
Just in regards to that, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but I need to ask it. Just in terms of the changes that you've made that you think make sense in terms of the hierarchy, objectives, policies and methods, those are, from your perspective, consistent with the thrust of the submissions from Ngāti Kahungunu Incorporated?
Yes. So just for background, if you will, so I assisted Ngāti Kahanunu with their pre-notification submission and as well as the drafting of the formal submission. I think there had been, I guess anecdotally, if you will, but I think there had been an effort throughout the tank process to all of these key issues haven't changed. And I think there was a hope that these would get addressed in a more direct way, in a more fundamental way within the drafting of the plan in its various versions. And obviously at this stage that wasn't happening, so I undertook that drafting exercise to assist the commissioners to see how the relief that Ngāti Kahanunu seeks could be provided. Yeah,
that's certainly what it said in the submission. Thank you. I just had if you could just provide me a little bit more in regard. This is in 44, I think, and 45 of your evidence in chief in regards to your preference for the review at 5 rather than 10-year intervals. And I just wondered if you had any further comments in that regard.
I think the intention there again was that Ngāti Kahungunu Incorporated's concern was that this is essentially kicking the ball down the field again by not committing to a review within the life of the plan. So the 5 years, the intention of that is to commit to that review. And again, as I guess addressed earlier, to provide some level of a transitional regime, but not so long that it then becomes not a transitional regime, which in my view, 5 years is more transitional than a 10-year review, and we know that planning processes can be very long.
So
I think
just taking that on
Yeah,
face
sorry.
value, had you considered in terms of what changes might be coming shortly in terms of the MPSFM 2020 and that I'm not sure whether the council is going to be notifying on the 31st of December
Yeah.
2024, but in that year it seems to make sense that that's most
Yeah.
likely where you might get notification, how that fits in the regime. In
Well,
terms
I
of
think
those
it could
transitions.
actually fit quite nicely because,
Yeah.
as Council has referred to in the 42A addendum as well, I believe it was in Ms. Edmonds' evidence that there will need to be a review of the values and objectives set out within PPC 9 at that time to ensure that it's giving effect to the MPSFM. So yes, I think there's some alignment that's achieved there through that 5-year commitment rather than the 10-year.
I did have a note, but it was something I raised this morning. It was just in regards to the freshwater management units, and some of the submissions were at different levels of understanding or awareness of where that might be. So I've requested that the council make a note or provide a note that sort of gives us the latest intel on where the FMU discussion is at, sort of as background information. Did you hear any other comments in regards to the FMUs?
I'm probably a district planner at heart, so I love the idea of zoning and, and FMUs are like freshwater zones.
Zoning
They're
provides certainty,
fantastic because I see Commissioner Cowie shaking his head. No, I think in following on from the questions of Mr. Smith, it seems that there may be an opportunity for a more sophisticated allocation regime that doesn't treat the aquifer as a bathtub, I think was the term that Commissioner Cowie used. And to me, that there is an opportunity there that FMUs may assist in that regard. I don't see necessarily an easy or clear pathway how to do that now without them, and also if there were some other way of doing that, I think it would potentially make the plan very confusing if those didn't align with FMUs or some similar tool.
Point taken. I'm just aware we've got one more speaker. Did we have any other questions? Yep, Dr. Cowie.
Can I just ask, your policy tank 1, is that drafted from a clean sheet or is that...
Apologies, Commissioner Cowie, could you turn the mic? I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Policy tank 1, sorry.
Yes.
Drafted from a clean sheet, not from existing words in the plan?
Yes, so...
Okay.
sorry.
That's all I need to know, thank you. I do quite like it.
Yes, so that the intention there was to ensure that there's a clear statement around Schedule 26, speaking to Commissioner Ryder's point earlier. And there is but it's not entirely plain, Commissioner Cowie, because you'll see that the text after it is deleted, so there's that wording that's deleted is from Council's.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Sorry,
you.
my apologies. I'm trying to remind myself.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. I'd just like to say it's it's always a bit of an effort to go through Word documents that aren't your own and try to make the changes obvious to us. Purple's an interesting colour, but depending on the screen you've got. It looks purple on my screen, but I'm not sure about the other commissioners. But thank you very much for the effort you've gone through in regards to making those changes to the version that we had in the Section 42A report. And as you would have heard this morning, we're intending to make a minute in regards to further comments regards to the addendum. So I'm not sure whether you're going to carry on the same exercise in regards to the addendum report, but it would certainly be worthwhile and assist the panel if you're are going to be undertaking any further work in that regard.
I will. I have considered the addendum and the track changes version, and as I set out in my summary, there's only 3 direct responses to my evidence within the addendum report,
Okay.
and so the track changes version at para 8 in my summary from this morning, there is a recommendation to accept some of the changes that I sought or suggested occur. Those are essentially drafting improvements, if you will, to objectives 10 through 14.
Okay.
So you see those in the addendum version that you have. There are no other changes to the council's track changes version as a result of a consideration of my evidence.
Okay, thank you, that's
within
helpful.
that.
Thanks very much. Mr. Enright?
Thank you. Mr Chair, our final speaker, appropriately the Chair of the Iwi Authority.
Tēnā koe te rangatira.
Ngāti rahonga I te rangi, ngāti pōporo karanga mai. Nahi mai o koutou manaaki ki tēnei kaupapa I tēnei wā, tēnā koutou katoa. For the sake of brevity, I'll cut straight into English. E te tūkana Roger, no kahanganu koe, ki tō taha, ko kahanganu ka moe taha te hau tāru ke o Pōtiki, so e rau kirikiri. Tēnei te mihi, tēnei te hononga ki a koe o te whānau apanui. Kahungunu me tōna tuakana ko Ranginui. Tēnā koe Antoine, ngai te rangi. Tauranga mōna, tauranga tarangata. Ka heke mai, mai kahungunu ki a māhina rangi me tūrongo, ka puta raukawa. Anō te hononga o tātou ki a tātou, ko taki timu te waka, kōrua ngā commissioners from the South Island, taki timu waka, and taki timu Rangers, nau mai hara mai, hoki mai ki tēnei pito taki timu, e tūtui ai tātou I runga I te hononga o ngā whakapapa. My first kaupapa is about the relationships and the importance of whakapapa, of who we are and why we're talking this way. I'm not a scientist, ologist, or a economist. I'm a storyteller. And so the storytelling of whakapapa binds us together. And we say, he taonga te wai. That the water is a taonga. And one of our greatest iterations of that taonga is our ori that we performed yesterday, pende pende te kura. Te kura is our word for taonga. Te kura is a word that we brought on the taki timu waka from the wānanga of the kahukura. The kura is a word that we use for the moa, and the feathers of the moa we called te kura. And so when we say he taonga te wai, we mean it implicitly, we mean it in connection, we mean it in physical and emotional and spiritual connection to whatever we're talking about. And today we're talking about the aquifer, the water bodies of Heretaunga, Ahuriri, that emanate from Tamatea. So ngā mihi ki a koutou I runga I te ēnei momo kōrero, pene pene te kura. We've been singing this for 500 years. And rau kirikiri whanau came in, liked it, took it and changed the words. And But we still sing it and we still perform it today, that it's a taonga, pene pene te kura, that we have this great gift, that we have this great treasure, and in terms of today's kaupapa, it's water. And so here we have, we knew all about the biological system of the human, and we use the land and the human form as metaphors for each other, that they're so connected that sometimes they're indivisible in our thinking. And so in our kōwhaiwhai patterns, and in the coming together of chromosomes to form a new being, we have our kōwhaiwhai patterns, which is a pattern of the channel of life through the whare tangata. And it's right across all our meeting houses and all our schools. It adorns government buildings now, and now it adorns business houses, talking about the channel of life, the regrowth, the rebirth, and the regeneration. And at 50 years ago at Karamu High School, I learned a term called fallopian tubes. I never thought I'd ever use it again, but here I am saying, here's the channel of life, our taonga, our kura, coming through our 500-year-old waiata called pene pene te kura. And the first question we ask when we meet each other is, ko wai koe, no wai koe, mō wai. So what waters birthed you? Ko wai koe, who are you? And what waters birthed you? So well, the water is intrinsic to who we are, because this is our first introductory iteration from one person to another. Ko wai, what waters do you come from? And so when we talk about the aquifer, when we talk about the hauku nui, when we talk about the ngariroro, it's intrinsically embedded in our whakapapa, in our DNA, in our emotive, psychological and spiritual thinking. No waikoe, where do you come from? What waters birthed you, your whānau, your hapu, and your iwi? We don't say who are your parents, we say who are your grandparents. And so what were the birth waters of you as a person? What's your whakapapa? And as I gave the whakapapa earlier, we come from here, but we can connect to tauranga, to ngaitahu, to takitimu, to whānau apanui. And so this questioning about what waters are intrinsic to who we are and are implicit to who we are as kahungunu, as takitimu, as Māori katoa. And so water is the essence of who we are. And that's why we talk about the scientific, hydrological, what are you again? Economic. Oh, economic. And these states, because they're intrinsically embedded in our thinking. And so as a metaphor for a new baby, pene pene te kura, growing in the womb. And again, this word kura, we call the womb the kurawaka. The kurawaka that protects the newborn in the sack of liquid, which we say is the whenua, the placenta, cleans it out, which is our whenua. And so our words are mixed and married and fused in our thinking of environment, of person, and of ideology and ambition. To poison or extract the water out of the womb, and to extract too much water out of the aquifer would be like sticking in a syringe into the womb and sucking out that water. What life would that womb create? Pene pene te kura, the greatest gift you could give. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. And so as we go through life, we leave our watery footprints. As we travel around the world, around the place, we always remember ko wai, no wai, mō wai. And so when you look at the environmental, transpirational cycle too, you see that it's similar to being born and cycling from the whenua to the whenua, and so on and so forth. Next one, please. So we have all these different names, and the header would have been more explicit and more definitive of what these names come from Matawaia, the first tier that drops on Paritu Maunga, that comes down to Te Awa, Te Kirikiri, right into Te Ukaipo, Te Muriwai Hauku Nui, and so on and so forth. These names are perpetuated in our whakapapa, and an obvious one to us is Te Ua Mairangi, Mārei, Jenny's tupuna, Te Ua Mairangi, the rain that just washes down from the mountainous summits out to the sea. Te Ua Mairangi, the tears of Ranginui kia Papatua Nuku. So even in our names, we keep that connection. We keep that, I think it's, in English it's called onomatopoeia, where we use the words and the sounds to describe the connection. Te Ua Mairangi. So we got this new kuta roa, that we knew about the wai, no wai, ko wai, mo wai, from way back. And again, I just emphasise kura as our precious gift. He taonga te wai, he kura te wai. We've got to protect it with everything we can, every tool we can. So we've been going to the tank table for the last 8 years, and we've been protecting the taonga, te wai, te kura, and it's been listened to with exquisite politeness and then ignored. And so I'll go straight to the other end. I think we should revisit the drafting of PC9 and have tangata whenua sitting right there with a hand on the pen, so there's no doubt, there's no ifs, there's no buts, there's no coming back 10 years later and say, what did you mean by this? That we draft, we tāmoko, we etch into the plan change our whakapapa, our psychology, our ideology, our pedagogy, so that we don't have to go into an independent commission to do it. Tai ao is the tai and the ao. Tai is the tide, ao is the earth. We have to listen to the rhythm and the tides of the earth. During COVID, we didn't need to help Papatua Nuku. She helped herself. Our rivers came clean, bird song in the morning, at night, clear stars, no smoke. So plan change 9 shouldn't be about trying to fix the environment. It should be trying to fix the people that regulate the environment. It's the people that need fixing, not the environment, because the environment, Papatua Nuku can look after herself very well. She's proven it over the last year during COVID. So this is the new arrival. The new arrival can be seen as the new seats and wards that have had a sweeping effect right throughout the country. There's a new arrival in town, sitting at those boards, and if we put a plan change in now, as it is, then those new arrivals, Māori representation on those wards, will be stuck with these plans for the next few years. Time is to reverse it, rewrite it, tāmoko tō mātou whakapapa into these plans, so that we never have to revisit it again. That they're stuck there and etched there forever. They never have to be reinterpreted, because te tai ao, you still feel the rhythm and rhyme of the land and of the aquifer and of the waterways. And when we etch this into any new plan changes, whatever they may be, then you are in rhythm with the tangata whenua, the tangata awa, tangata moana, and so on and so forth. So, finally, we also have these. We've got the blood moon coming up tonight, so I thought I'd put this up too. That our tipuna te whatuiapiti, he was named after this comet. This is in our waiata too, ko te umu rangi. Umu, hangi, stone, rangi, flying through the sky, Whatu, the face, apati, the tail. It was a comet. So we're in touch with our environment in the heavens. We're touched with our environment in the earth. Kahukura is the rainbow and all its splendour, but it's a whole circle. It goes right into the earth and comes out the other end. And so our being is universal, it is celestial, it is terrestrial, and we bring this into planned changes that can be etched into the future of Aotearoa New Zealand with our new advocates on the board. The Western science is well known, famous, but a lot of it's been tapped out. Our science, our mātauranga Māori, hasn't even been tapped into. So we're not coming here to challenge, we're coming here to offer our cultural, our mātauranga, our whakapapa, and embed it in these plans so that there's no ifs, no buts, no doubts that we are going together, that we do really care about the environment. Because Māori economists do. There are more Māori now getting into horticulture, agriculture, not just Māori culture anymore. And we're part of the whole spectrum. So the mana o te wai was about protection, firstly. Second, about enabling. Thirdly, about sustainability. And so it's quite explicit, it's quite definitive. If we use those terms, we help build those terms. And so, kia kaha, kia u, ki tō tātou taonga tuku iho ngā mātua tipuna. Let's adhere and stick to the knowledge handed down by our ancestors to carve and tāmoko into any planned changes that are coming to the future. We're from the iwi, we're here to help. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Good. Tēnā. I'm not sure that's the type of presentation that we ask questions of. A kanui ngā mihi e tarangatira, o tira tuatahi mo tō mihi ki etahi o ngā kai komihana, nā tō waka, ngā hononga, no reira he mihi kawana a kia koe, me ngā kārangatanga kei wainganui a koe, no reira kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Hey, thank you very much for your presentations. Ko te kura nui, ko te kura roa, ko te kura o ta whitina tū hai pō. Tēnei te tira hau, tēnei hara mai nei, ko te murangi nā te whatuia piti, nau mai e tama, ki te tai au nei, kia whakanunu a koe, ki te kahi katoa, ki te kūmata kūru, ki te tara o ngā onga, ngā tai ora e ngā hau e kupe, I wai hoi te au nei. Hiki ake ngake ake, I te tohua rewa, te ara o tā whaki, I whiki ai ki runga, I roko hinga tura, mai tuku makaka, hapa e wauri, he wahai pāmai, taku wahine purotu, taku tāne purotu, korua ko te tau e. We're just going to take 1 minute. I'm just going to stretch my legs. My left leg seems to have gone numb. I think it's an old rugby injury. Mr. Enright, we've received your legal submission, and we've also obviously read the submission of your client.
Yes.
And we were happy for you to elaborate on any particular points, and if we had any questions.
Thank you. Within the space of 5 minutes, you've already heard most of the legal points already. I think what's new from the environmental defence perspective is just giving you a bit more on some of the case law. There are, you might say, a bit of a grey area, but actually my submission is Section 67 RMA is very, very clear, and some of those earlier cases related to earlier iterations of the MPS. Anyway, you've got the legal submissions there, and no doubt you'll hear from other lawyers on that as we move through. I think a key point from EDS's perspective is there's a spectrum, obviously, where in some of those cases you're at the very tail end of the statutory process, where in fact you're in the High Court on points of law. It's very hard to compare that to here, where we don't have a decisions version yet. Therefore, there's no reason you should not be giving effect to the MPS-FM. And then EDS's argument is that on scope, while it agrees in general terms with the Council's legal submissions on that, it does say that you should take a further step forward and look at implementing FMUs and implementing the other parameters in the target attributes, albeit limited to the tank catchment. Now, there is an error in paragraph 32 I'd like to correct on that point, where it says in the second sentence, EDS considers there is scope within change 9 and its own submission to comprehensively identify all FMUs within the region. That's wrong, and that should simply say within the tank catchment. That is a hard line for scope, as we can't go outside the tank catchment. So the concluding comment very much mirrors the Ngāti Kahungunu position as well, that your two pathways are to make substantial changes to give effect to the MPS-FM and the other higher order instruments, or to withdraw or decline, start again, allow the NPS-FM process to pick this up by 2024. So, I mean, that's the argument, basically, in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't have any specific questions. I'll ask the panel members if they do, but it was quite helpful having some commentary on the relevant case law rather than just getting the case itself with maybe highlighted.
Sure.
So that was most helpful in
Okay, good.
those which you thought were more relevant than others. That was helpful. Thank you.
What he said.
Thank you.
It must be our Taki Timu connection.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Our concluding submitter for today, Mr. Owen Jiri Tapuku. Tēnā koe te rangatira. Kai a koe te wā whakamutunga.
Kia ora tata. Kei te tūmai ki tēnei, te mihi tuatahi, ki tō tātou matanui te rangi. E mihi kia te atua. Nā te tīmatatanga, nā te kupu, nā te atua. Nā te atua, te kupu whakamutunga. He honore, he gloria, he magarongo, he whakaaro pai ki ngā. E te kupu mo tēnei tō tātou amorangi, kei te wītu tau hueta. Ko te amorangi ki mua, ko te hāpai o ki muri. Kei te tūturutanga mahi pono o te Māori mana motu hake. E te tūmai ki tēnei, te kupu i tēnei tō tātou atua. Ko pāhemo me te rangi me te whenua, kāre he pāhemo ki te kupu he wai Māori. Ne, ake tōnu. Kei tōnei nā kōrero mō tēnei. Kei te tūake he mihi mō tēnei. te taumata kei mua, tēnā koutou. Rau, tēnā koe. Mo tēnei te kapitān, ki a koe Roger, kei a koe mo tēnei te mihika o nei kia. O tāua tō tēnei o nā tīpuna, kei tēnei. Tau tahi, mo tēnei. E mihi mo tēnei. Ki a koe, nai te rangi, tēnā koe. Ko kei tēnei o nā tīpuna mātou.
Ai.
Ira mo ta pakenga ki Gate Pau. Pakenga nu o te ao.
Ai, te kanu.
O reira e mihi tēnā kōrua, tēnā kouta, ki ora tata. Huri no mo tēnei, no taha mo tēnei ki a rata. Huri no te whare, huri no te haukainga, tēnā kouta, ki a koe hori, mo tēnei tō api tō tēki mo tēnei, kaupapa mo tēnei wa. E mihi mo tēnei te whare tīpuna, a hiko wera, ko koe tēnei te taha mo tēnei. E te tūma, ko hine te mo tēnei katua. E mihi kawana kia kota. Kei mua mo tēnei te whare, whakahua o nā tīpuna, te hapoku te hika nui o te mona. Kei te tūmai ki tēnei, e ako mokopuna. E tā whai mo tēnei, te kōrero mo tēnei, e whakapapatanga mo tēnei tō tātou tīpuna. Ko koe tēnei. Ko koe tēnei nā kōrero mo tēnei ki a māre mo te taio. You read my report, eh? Oh, well, I don't address that, eh? I'll just put it on the side. E whakapapatanga mo tēnei, te kōrero mo tēnei, te mōna o Pokau. I'll just go a bit of English, I suppose. But I just want to say, my tīpuna had 10 wives, more than kahununu anyway. Hey. Kei te mea tuatahi ko Ruiha, ko Whanganui. He married all these women because they had water. Hey? Ruiha from Whanganui had the Whanganui River. And then he married Te Heipora, Noku. He had the Tukituki River. And he married Waitiri from Mohaka. She had the Mohaka River. And then he married Hinarangia from Pakipaki. She had the Awanui River. Eh? And then he married Whakarongo from Tamaki Arua. She had the Manawatu River. Okay? And then he married Iotipuna, ko Opotiki, and he had the ocean. So kei a koe rau, o tāua ki tēnei wa. So I just want to make a few comments about Pakawa Mōna. Pakawa, i nāne me te kōrero, hey, they call it the Waiu, but i ngā wā o mua it was Pakawa, te moana. Nā te pepeha, mō tēnā, hey, our pepeha goes, hey, ko kahurāniki, mai atu ki te wheo te maunga. Te wheo, te pā, te kōhanga o ngā rangatira. Hey? Te whati āpiti, te wāwahanga, ko te rangi kawhiua, ko te manawa kawa, ko te rangi koanake. Te rangi koanake, pa mō ia ngāwa, ka puta mai, te rangi koanake tuarua. Pa mō ia tātari, hinaki kaituna, ko tapuhara, ko te prae. Ka puta mai te hāpaku, te ike nui o te mona. E moko puna ki au. Nā, ko Pakawa te moana. Kei te whawhai e toko rua. Ko rangi kawhiua, ko rangi hirowera. Kei te riri mo tēnei rangi kawhiua, mo tangi teina. Kei te whawhai kei runga i te wheo, ka wehe atu ki rangi kawhiua. Kei te taha mo tēnei he pukiti, me te whenu. Kei te tū mai ki tēnei rangi kawhiua, kawhiua, kei te titiro o tōna teina. Hai, ki tēnei te pau i roto te mona, te pau kawa. Ko koe tēnei he tūna momona kia rangi ka, rangi hiroena. Those are my eels. They're the best eels. You can have all the thin ones. Te kawa o ngā tuna. Oh, kei te pukariri te tuakana. Ko patua ki tēnei. Ko tātou teina. Ka mate, kōti. Ko koe tēnei. At pokawa kei te rere nei. Kei te rere nei ki te taha o te maunga o kaua hei. Ka rere nei ki tēnei te moana ki Pukikawa. O Pukikawa, mai atu ki tēnei nā whakatātara. Kei te rere nei ki te moana ki te mahanga. Kei te rere nei ki tēnei te moana ki Pukiti. Ko Pukiti, ko mai atu ki Peka Peka. Ko Peka Peka, mai atu ki te Karamu, mai atu ki Tangaroa. The beginning of all waters started in Pokawa. I don't see it on this board in the front of me. I see every other river and name. I don't see Pokawa. Hey, you fellow made a mistake, Marty. With Pokawa.
No, not to here.
That's the most famous river in all Ngāti Kahununu. I just want to say that, yeah. I just want to rectify that. Make sure you put Pokawa top of the shop. Engari, ko koe tēnei. Ka haroha mo tēnei te haukai. Ke koro mo tēnei te kararewa. Mo tēnei te awa. Ne? Kore? Kei te haere mo tēnei. Kei te tīmatatanga mo tēnei. Ne? Yeah, paritu. Yeah, paritu. Nā, ko koe tēnei. Ka maroke e nāni. Kei koutou e aroha mo tēnei te haukaiga. Kei whawhai mo tēnei. Te Pākehā. Kei mua ki a koutou. You use a word that goes like poko kahua. But that's all right. So, kei konei te Pākehā, kei te rata. Engari, kei te mihi mo tēnei ki ai. I runga mo tēnei, te kōrero mo tēnei wā. So, mo tēnei te kai whakawā kōrua. Dr. Ryder, tēnā koe. Or Dr. Cowie, tēnā kōrua. You know, I bought this whole books of kōrero. And when I got the pānui, they said I can only speak for 3 minutes.
Well, we've already broken that.
Yeah, but that's okay. And then I got the call from Peter P. He said he can speak for an hour. So they're going to close at 4 o'clock. I said, oh, that's all right. I'll get another half an hour yet. That's okay. Ko koe tēnei, nā kōrero ki tēnei. I just want to read something about Lake Pokawa. If I may indulge the tape with this little bit of kōrero. And this is a kia ora. My name is Owen Jerry Hapuka. My mother gave me Owen. All my other 12 siblings, they all got Māori names. I'm the only one out of 12 that hasn't got a Māori, 13 that hasn't got a Māori name. So she named me. I said, why'd you give me a name like Owen, Mum? She said, she'd be proud of that name, son. I said, why is that? Because she's the lady that brought you into the world. She was the midwife. In 1941, March the 10th, I was born. So I'm 80 years old. Don't look so bad for 80, so. But that's okay. Yeah, my parents are Arapata Maruhe and Mere Toko Pākai. My life is full of stories that came from my grandfather, who in turn was told to us by our grandmother. Towards the last few years of her life, our grandmother took over the running of the family. Hers was a long day milking 50-odd cows by hand, releasing them out on the Pokawa Lake to graze, collecting them in the afternoon to milk. Our home, like most that lived in Te Hauke, we had to cook on earthen wood fires or open fires. Our weekends, we would hitch our horse, Jimmy Jim, to the sledge, grab our spear, and go to the lake to collect firewood. While some of us loaded the sledge, others would go and try and catch a tuna or two if they were lucky enough. To feed our families. Sometimes we were instructed to cut the flax to make kite and whāraki. Alright, ko ia nei te pokawa moana. Yes, this is pokawa, giving of milk to feed of people. One story told by my grandmother, which is firmly embedded in my mind, when she was young, with her mother and others of the kāinga, as was the custom, would go by dugout canoe to other parts of the lake during the summer months and make camp. Their whare was made out of rope or ponga. They would stay there for weeks, catching eels, drying them. Young birds were caught, dressed, and preserved. She had an experience one day. My grandmother and my mum heard strange singing. Arriving to where they thought the singing was, kua kore. Nothing was there. And he told Mum it was the Turehe people, a strange people. Some say our forebear. The Patiapiti was a descendant of such a marriage between the Māori and the Turehe people. Kauahe Mountain was the place where they lived. Te Kena was another. When the Ngāhere forest was cut down, they became no more. They were a kind and humble people. It is said their homes were the forests, cut down, and they are no more. We, the people of Te Hauke, have no desire to be like Turehu. We are the Morehu, the remnants of those people who, on leaving us the legacy, watch over the Mona o Pokawa. Our kāinga is Te Hauke. Our whare is beneath the Wairako stream. Rotuera runs down the Wairako into Pokawa. My whare wānanga house of learning is called Kahurani. My hapu is called Nai Te Rawi Koanake. Ngāti Manawa Kawa and Nai Turehui. And like many family groups, come in unity and then became one with Nai Te Patiapiti. My pare kāre ranga mahatanga, our seed bed were te peo. Rotu a tara and pātangata in Te Hauke. Nā puke o koa roa me Raukawa. The hills of Raukawa to the north and west stand like sentinels watching over its people. We learn many things in our house of learning. Kahuranaki, stories of old, stories like Pokawa, the spirituality of its people. This is the way to other people, to Māori and to Pākehā, hei oi ngā tangata katoa. Ka au e rawa kia tia ki te Pokawa waia. Te wai ora katoa ara, te wai Māori, te wai ana mana. Do not tamper with Pokawa moana. Water is its life force. The fresh water is its well-being. Our mātua tipuna Pokawa moana, our parent mother Pokawa. Pokawa tataka kai tuna, e rāme, no nā kai Māori, kare e morehu. Mo tēnei te kōrero, mo tēnei piripi. Pokawa, whose storehouses were once filled with overflowing to feed our people. What are some of the ingredients of Pokawa moana? The many tuna, freshwater crayfish, kiwai, kakahi, or freshwater mussels, carp or morihang, the haumanu or birds' eggs, the manu bird life, pātiki, and a whole mema mō tēnei. Ai, te tika ko ia ngā Pokawa wai, Pokawa moana, te tino matua o te kāinga i Te Hauke. Yes, it is right, Pokawa is our great parent from our place to Hauke right around the lake. Let not our mother Pokawa Waiu become like a relative. Rotu ātala. Ka oi kororo mai ki a arohane ki a koe, Roger, ko patu hatuma, mo tēnei ta tuatahi, ko rotu ātala, rotu ākiwa, Pokawa. Those 4 lakes were the backbone of all our people. Fresh water. You know, when we were kids, we used to drink the water out of our lake. Just play around on the lake, on the water, get thirsty, put it in your mouth. Now, you wouldn't want to put it in now. Poison. Because of all the things that's happening around us. Farmers put their things that come from their land into the water. Kei te tangi nā kau mō roto ātala. The Hapaku didn't want Pokawa to be like roto ātala. Kei te tangi mō tēnei te tipuna ki roto ātala. Ko koe tēnei e ngā whakapapa ki roto ātala. Te pātāpito o mahinarangi. Kahutea. Nā, kei te awa, kei te moana, mo tēnei te motu, te awa rua o poriru. Nā ka whawhai mo tēnei. Nā pakinga i ngā wā omba. So, kei te tangi o ngā mātou nākau o rotu ātara. Nākau manawa, wā mua Pokawa. Moana. I ngā rā I nai nei, our hearts are worried. Some of those times for our lake, Pokawa. We have been told the landmass surrounding the water of Pokawa is sinking every year, accelerating at an alarming rate. The Hapaku didn't want the water to go from Pokawa. They wanted the water to stay there, feed these people. They wanted to go out anyway. As soon as he died, they started to dig drains. They started to do all sorts. They called in regional, well, not the regional council, the one before that. The what? Yeah. They started to make these decisions about Lake Pokawa, to cut a drain to let the water out. But he didn't want that to happen. He wanted the water to be the lifeblood of his people. So, our old chief, Te Hapaku, Te Ikanui o Te Mona, those many years ago, let the covenant on his lake. That covenant has been broken many times. And I say to us on behalf of Pokawa Mona, let mana laws find a solution to nature's environment for man's sake. Ko pe kouta, people is here to find a way, the solution to what we've been talking about today. The solution to make sure that this plan change 9, whatever it is, we object. Because let mana laws find a solution to nature's environment for man's sake. My whakapapa in the connection to this lake is famous. Whakapapa of our tipuna. He was the paramount chief of all our people, and I am his mokopuna. Ko heke mai ki rākai hikurua, ko taipa, ko takaha, ko hikawera, pati āpiti, te wāwahanga, ko te rangi kapio, ko te manawa kaua, ko te rangi koanake. Rangi koanake, ko te mai whitia. Te mai whitia, rangi koanake tuarua, ko te Hapaku, te Ikanui o te Moana. Ko mo ia, ko toku te kau, nā, ke a mātou, ko whaitiri, i mohaka. Te kahu o te rangi. Ko te reita tipuna. I mohaka, ka mo ia te ara, ka puta mai, hukopo. Hukopo, ka puta mai, paututu, Pautiri wā ka moia niwa, ka putu mai, waitiri ka moia, te hapuku te ike nui o te mola. Ka putu mai ara pata tuatahi. Ka moia o riwi a pare one o te mahia. Ka putu mai nāruhe. Nāruhe ka moia pāpā ki te rangi, paitiri, kāpia mone, tainui waka. Ka putu mai he te kupāpā, ara pata tuarua. Ka moia mere toko pākai, ki te hōpū ninge mātangi rau, ki hitu, ka putu mai ahau. Ka moia ahau, ko pare manu whiri, riu pāpere, ko tainui waka. Ane, ko koe tēnei, te tuake mo tēnei te mihi, te kota. Ko kuni nei te mutunga mo tēnei te kore, mo tēnei wa. Ke kaha kota, ke kaha mo tēnei te kaunihera. Ke kaha te iwi, ke kaha mo tēnei. Whawhai. E api e teki mo tēnei. Te kaupapa mo tēnei wa. Ka are mo tēnei, ko wehe atu. Ka. Ko pāhe mo me te rangi me te whenua. Heaven and earth may pass away, but water will remain forever. Water will remain forever. It's the substance of our life. Water is the main component of anybody's existence. You can go without food, but you can't go without water. Water brings us life. There's a whole lot of things for a whole lot of people in different ways. For us as Māori, we he taonga. The way Māori he taonga. He taonga mo tēnei maaki, mo tēnei mata. Ka kaha mo tēnei kouta. Kei rongo mo tēnei te kōrero, mo tēnei tono, wero. Ko ke tēnā. Ke kaha kouta. Ka pute ki tēnei kōrero mo tēnei wa. So, that cuts out of half of my speech. But just before I finish, I just want to say this little relationship that may help us. Relationships thrive when problems are brought up and dealt with when people are in good moods, using their free flow and common sense, thinking and deeply listening to each other. And the problems are dealt with using understanding and wisdom. This is a story about two ants. They stood before the stone that had rolled in front of the entrance to their nest. The other ant said, "Too big, we can't move it." He said, "Nah, we could push that aside," said the other. "It's huge. We'll never..." Well, I can't read my own writing. "We'll never move it." Now, this is what that first ant said. "Well, with a big crew, we'll be able to roll it away." Never, we'll never roll it. It will roll away. Never. It's stuck. We're stuck. The third ant had been listening. He said, "You should think we can move it." Oh, sorry, I'll start again. A third ant had been listening. He said, "You think we can move it? You think we can't? Are you both right?" So, dwell on that little duty that I finished with my kōrero today. That hopefully what we're done today to help rectify the problems with water, let it flow. Let no man be the keeper of water. Water is shared by everybody. So, ke aroha ano i tēnei te haukainga, ko maroke ki tōna awa. Kare mo tēnei te haere ki tēnei ngā kaukau, ngā tamariki, ngā mokopuna. E whiwhi mo tēnei o ngā tuna, e ngā kaura hāna, ko wai water krihi ano. You go out there, you're on that bridge, you look at that creek, it's dry as a bone. I was told it'd be like that for 11 months. So, kia kota. E tino aroha mo tēnei kia kota. E tangi mo tēnei wā. As well, to Harper, who didn't come over this way to marry one of you fellas, he would have owned that water out there as well. And he would have rectified it without any problems. Yeah. So all those wives I named that had water, kapai. You know? So it's very important. Water is for everybody. And I'll just say to the kaunihera, kia kaha kota. Hey. If we listen with one ear, and let it stay in there. Don't let it go in one ear and out the other. Ko ke tēnei nā kōru Māori. Ka whiua ki tēnei tō taringa mātau, kei hoi atu tēnei mātau. Go in one ear and out the other. No, kia kaha kota. E pai ki tēnei tō kōru mo tēnei kia kota. Huri no o ta whare. Tēnā rā kota kia koe. Me tēnei te kaunihera mo tēnei e noho, mai clues. Tēnā koe mai. Ai pai te kiti a koe. Ko ke tēnei, ke kahau mo tēnei tō kouhau i te wiki e pāhurina. Ka tāma. So, if anyone wants a copy of these, I'll be gladly to distribute them, but might help you in future thinking about water. So, the water, as I said, we need water. And if we don't, we're all going to die. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, kia ora.
Ka pine a koe a,
Ki te pine o te aroha, Ki te pine e kore nei e waikura e.
kai
Timu kai pai, Tai hoa e haere, Ia mutu takuri, I roi matai.
Rere a kapiti hono, tatai hono. A te hunga mate, ki te hunga mate. Kei te wiki e pahuri nei, ki te rā, ko tēnei, te tangata whero, kei noho mo tēnei tō tātou kura, kaupapa Māori, mai atu ki kahurani. Haere mō tēnei kota, haere, moi mai. Ka piti hono, tātai hono, a te hunga ora, huri noa, tēnā kota, tēnā kota. I just thought I'll give you one. Oh. Have a look at the name over there.
Lovely. If you can't read it, there's a pen that's been given to us and it says, kia tūpato. It says Jerry Hapuku, TKR, Turi Pai Whenua, 13 Sexton Street.
Ka tira, Jerry, tēnei te mihi atu kia koe. Kia tāwara, me ngā whakapapa katoa e hono nei a tāwa. O ngā kau I wō kōrero mō pau kāwa, e ki ana koe ko te kawa, tērā, ko te kawa o te tuna. Engari mena he tuna kei kora, I tako mōhio me rekarawa atu te tuna rā, I te tuna kawa. Engari e kōrero tia nei, rongo ake mātau, ko ngara haere katoa ngā tuna. Mena ke te tika tērā, kāre aro ake ki wō kōrero, mena he kawa he aharane. Engari, ka whakaro ake ki wō kōrero mō tēnei me te whakapapa. E hono haere nei ngā awa. Aro ngā kau I a koe kōrero ana ko tēnei awa me tērā awa a ka puta mai ka haere tahi ai me ngā whakapapa o te tanga. Anei, e noho nei koutou. Anei he. Pērā i ngā whakapapa ka hu mai i ngā maunga. Ka tiro a kau, ara tarana ke noho moke mai ana. Koi ana. Ka huri mai koe kia ngā rua hoi kia rua pegu, ara tāua e piri ana. Tāra. Koe ina hau e tiro nei ki we nei awa. E piri tahi nei. E piri tahi nei me ngā whakapapa katoa. Tā rātau i kawe mai ko te tangata ko koutou. Nā reira, koe na noheo wā koe nei mihi ki a koe tēnei wā. Aha koa e hiu nei ngā tau, tāua tahi e huka haere nei runga i te mato o te whenu. Ka tiru a te au ki a koe, hei te ororo atu tēnei krou. Hei te ororo atu. Engari ko a tāua whakapapa, e hono haere nei ia mā tātua waka, ia tāki tumu waka, me ngā waka katoa. Tai hoa ke ki te ai, e hanga hua mō wā tāua mokopuna. Koina te pūtake, te tino pūtake oe nei hui. Ke tiro hea ake, ke hea te ao mō a tātou mokopuna. Reira, koe nohe wā koe nei mihi kia koe. Mō tō kaha ki te haramai ki a tātou, tō toa haere o pene, me o kōrero, e rawe te rongoa. Koe nā kōrero e pirangi e au te rongo i te rangi nei. Kei he tēnei me te hohunutanga o tō tāua ao. Ko ngaro hai. Ko ngaro hai ngā kōrero e kōrero tia nei e te hunga Pākehā. Kia hoki rāno tāua, kia rātau. Ka tahia no pēr, ka kitea he rongoa. Reira, e mihi kau ana tēnei kia koutou, kia tātou koutora. Aku ni tonu a hau ka o he atu. Nara me tū tika tonu a hau ki te mihi kia tātou. I te poroporo aki kia tātou me tēnei hui. Me ngā wero ko whakatakoto tia ki mui a tātou i tēnei wā. Kei he te kiko o tēnei mahi e mahi nei. Koenea tā koe rongo ake nei. Kei he tāua te Māori roto i ue nei kōrero. Koenea tā koe rongo ake nei. Ke puta rāno mai te kiko o tēnei me te ao Māori. Ngā tahi anō ka tūranga tira ai tātou katoa. Engari tēnei wā, e te ngōki haere noheo tātou. E te tiro haere me pēhea e mahi, ngā mahi e kōrero tēnei e te hungane. Nā te mea, nā rātou kewe nei kōrero. Kei whea wā tātou kōrero. Kei whea ngā kōrero i tīmata mai ai, we nei, mahi e mahi nei, trangi nei. Kārekau. Kārekau, koina tā koe e kōrero nei. Nā reira, kia kaha tonu tātou. E hea te mea nā koutou nake tēnei wero, nā tātou katoa. Ka haere koe ki roto te whānau apanui, ki roto Ngāti Prau, mā tātua waka whānui tonu. Kei reira anō e nei kōrero. E rite wā rātau kōrero, wā rātau nawe, ki ngā nawe e rongo ake nei ahau, i konei. Nā reira kia kaha koutou. Tēnei te mihi atu. Te mihi atu kia koutou. Au atu ngā mea pera i a ngā hiwi, i a Mārei, i a Māori. Ko ronga no atu au kia rāu, tātou e kōrero anu. Engari, koina tonu ngā kōrero e rongo ake nei i nāinei nā mai ngā tau, ko pahure. E hai te mea ko titi haere wa rātou kōrero e kāo. ke te hāngai tika tunu wa rātou kōrero, mai ngā tau ko tahaki. Ka tai mai ki tēnei rangi, ka rongo ake au ki a rātou, kei te pērā tunu wa rātou kōrero. Ka pātai ahau nā te aha. Nā te aha. Areira, koina te wero. Ki te ai, me pēhe ai, e whakakaukau mai katoa, wera pātai, wera nawe. Kia pai te kōkuri haere, kia puta mai te rongoa, mō tātou katoa, mō ngā iwi katoa. Nā reira, ngā tika hungunu, whānui, tēnā koutou. Ngā ringa wera, e whangai haere nei a tātou i ngā rā, e toru ko pahurake nei, tēnā koutou. Nā tō, te kiko o taku kōrero, te manaakitanga o te tangata. Painoheo kia tātou, te mahi pērā. Ka reira aroake, ka tai mai te manuhiri, ka whaangaitia. Koe nā no, me pērā anō te mahi mō ngā awa nei. Ka hara mai te wai, whaangaitia. Whaangaitia. Reira, ka rea mō te whakaroro haere wā tātou kōrero i tēnei wā. Engari kia rongo ake koutou ki ngā nawe ki roto i au. Mō wā tātou wai. Koe aro ake kua au tētahi o ngā hamuti e noho nei ki tēnei tā. Anei ke te, anei, ke roto nei. Tiru haere ana, kei he te oranga mō a tātou wai, kei he te oranga mō a tātou awa, kei he te oranga mō ngā kai katoa e kōrero tia nei ko ngaro. Reira, e mihi kauana, kia koutou katoa, kia koutou ngā kaimahi o te kaunihira tēnā koutou. Kaua aro ake ki ngā kōrero e e ki ana a Jerry, tai hoa ki ngā kōrero ka puta kia uru atu ki tēnei taringa kawe tukunāt e kao. Whāngai ti atu ki a rātau. Kawe mau i konei. Whāngai ka haere koutou, ka mutu atu i tēnei hui. Haere koutou ki te mea anei ngā whakaaro o te hunga nei. Mena ki te kore, ka hatia rātou. Ka rarate rātou mo te mōhio anei ngā whakaaro o ngā tikahungu. Mō a rātou wai. Ta koe ana taku inua atu kia koutou. Kia tika tono te rongo, engari kia kaha tonu te kōrero. Kia i rātu. Wahi tia mai wa rātou nawe kia rātou. Wahi tia mai a rātou tangi kia rātou e tangi nei kia koutou. Engari me whakawhānui te atu. Ngā kōrero kia mohi hai te ao katoa a anei. Ngā nawe, anei ngā mamaitanga, ngā taumahatanga o tini mua rātou wai. Ko te wai, te tino take nui o tēnei ao. Ana e kōrero tia te pukapuka nei, te mano o te wai, e ha te mea tuatahi ko te wai. O te mea tuarua ko te tangata. O te mea tuatoru ko ngā take i kōrero tia ai te tangata i mō te tāke nei. Te taha ki te mahi moni. Engari ko te tino mea nui ramat, ko te wai. Ko tātou e ware, ko ine te mea nui, ko te wai. Whae e katoa ngā huarahi, hei whangai te wai, hei araake i te orangatanga o te wai, me ngā mahi katoa e pāna ki ngā mahi e ngāwai nei i te wai. A reira, e mihi ai, kia tātou katoa. Ka re kōrero atu, tua ki tērā. A reira, huri noa ka tātou e whare tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Ora.
Engari, ko whānu ko teke e taku waiata. Te waiata a te kōti. E koutou. E koutou. E re, ka huri atu au ki tērā atua ngā waiata o te waka mā tātou. E tahi ua tātou national anthems. Tagura kaue. Tagura wa ki te whare. Ka mua ka kai e. Te whare o te kai katoa. Ka oi aku ni e. Aku tangi mō koutou. Maupuru no te iwi e. Ka moai tonu te whenua e ka koto nei. Engari e tika tonu ana ngā kōrero o tā tāua waiata pene te kura. Tika tā hau ngā himi o te kura tērā o ngā mea katoa. E kōrero tiana o a tātou whakapapa, a tātou wai, a tātou aharane, e tuitui haere nei i a tātou. Nā reira huri noa, o tātou whare tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora.
Ana me te aro o te kawetaka ki te hipota hane. Mamana ki takatai mai te wai. A tēnei au e tū me ki rā hei wāngai mo tēnei te kaungi hera e noho tētahi wharirau. A kai o ki kene ngā kōrero mai i tēnā mai. Kai o ki rā ki tēnei mai. Ngā te rahu ki rangi, ngā te pau harekura, ngā te whāhu. Tēnei te mihi o kōtu. Kai rungai te whakaro, hau mai kia mātau, tēnei, kia whakariti ai te tūwhera kapa o tēnei, me ki rā, Clan Change 9. Ngā kōtau tēnā o ngā whakaro, kia tūwhera hiai e nei ngā rangi ko pahurea tēnei, kia whangai ai tēnā, te iwi ai watu kai o ki tēnei o ngā wānanga. Ngā kōtau, e muri rā, e manaki ai te tangata, mai te timatatanga o tēnei o ngā wānanga kai hoki rā ki ono otina, me hira te wānanga tuatahi e haere rea tēne. Ka kunei e niti kia koe rea kōtri kai hoki rā ki ena ngā hapu o tēnei o tāna ki mara. Kei ruma i au nei kōrero, he mana kai ruma ki tēnei ngā haere reta. O tāku e tū nei i te aroaro o ene ngā komihana, he māngai mo tēnei o ngā pai, ki te mihiko o koutou. Whakaranga tira hea i o tēnei kaupapa, kai atu ki tēnei o ngā wā. Nui te mihiko o koutou. Nā koutou manaki mai i ene, nā koutou manaki mai ngā manuhiri au watu kai roto ki tēnei. Kai hoki rā ki tēnei o ngā mutunga, tēnei te mihi atu. A tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, huri no tēnā tātai. Ka kutu nei, ono miniti e toiana. Aroha mai, kia tuku tēnei wahanga ki te tiamana, o tēnei o te teru kainga, e kōrero mōna motakai. He muri aki tēnā, he waita tēma whakau, tēnei te mihi. Tuku atu ki a koe rā te tiamana, e osi mai tā pōro te rarina. Muri mai tēnā, e te iwi tukuna, kia ore atu.
Kia ora mai tātou. He honore ki te tū i mui a koutou i tēnei wā. Ki tahi māku i te toka ngā mihi, a kua mihia i mui aha.
mihi ki ta manaakitanga o ta haukainga. Ko ki toko pōku, kōpū, te rewa. E mihi kawana ki ngā ringawera, ia rā, e whangai a mātou. E mihi kawana kia koe e ta rangatira kōdre, me o whānau, e manaki a mātou, mai te tīmatanga ki tēnei haura. Ka nui ngā mihi aroha tēnei kia koe, kia koutou katoa o te haukainga. E mihi kawana ki Ngāti Kahungunu whānui tonu. Ko tai mai nei, ia rā, ki te whakaputa ngā kōrero, i runga e tarangi māre, me te aroha, o tira, te hi, e mihi kawana ki te ihi, te wehi, te wana, me te tapu o ngā kōrero, ko puta mai i tēnei wiki. I'd just like to thank and endorse those speakers before me. I'd like to acknowledge the Haukainga for your wonderful welcome and your hospitality from the start of this hearing to this point. I'd like to also acknowledge the work that's gone on before this hearing to make it possible that you could come to the hearing and present to us. And we'd like to acknowledge how difficult that is for everybody. Some people are very used to that process, and some people are very new to it. And so I'd like to acknowledge those who've come to this process for the very first time, but also acknowledge the hard yards and the journey that those who have journeyed many years to get to this particular point. Maggie here represents the start of it. This is her very first hearing. So those of you who remember your first hearing, I can't remember my first hearing. This is her very first of many. And she has often said and commented what a wonderful experience this has been. This is all quite new. And to thank you on her behalf for the hospitality you've shown her coming to this place like some of us as Waiwaita. Ro has already spoken on her behalf to thank everybody, so I'd like to endorse all those things that he has said. This is the start of a few weeks that we have in front of us, but also the deliberations that we will think about very carefully. But I'd also like to acknowledge the council and all the staff that have been here throughout the whole week. We heard on Monday those who were disappointed that the politicians turned up for the first 5 minutes, had morning tea and then left. But that's the way of politics, that's the way of these things. But the staff, the representatives of the council have been here the whole time, and they have heard you with one ear, and that is, and those sounds, those words are firmly within their heads, and we hope that they have heard, I'm sure they have heard the submissions loud and clear as we have. Hui anō, he mihi whakamutunga tēnei kia koutou e tā hukainga, mo tō manaakitanga, ngā whakaro pai kia mātou i tēnei wiki, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tata.
Nei rā tō mai. Engari mai te kahi atu o ngā awa. Ki au tiku o hanganu i nei mai. Anō te pai te ataua, o ngā no o ngā tui, o ngā taina o ngā tuakana, e runga i te aroa pumau.
Nō reira, nā ngā kai komihana, e mihi kawana kia koutou rā, tō mana ki ngā whakarapai, i runga i te aroha, nō reira kaore e kōrero poroporo aki. Ko te mea nui, te koro o ngā tupuna, mā te wā e tūtaki tātou, nō reira, mā te wā. You do it for fun.
Nā mihi rawa roa kia koutu mā tai koutu. Kia koutu te hui, me te koutu tāna mai ki tōku marae, ki roki te whare rei a hine tēmu. Kei te pātoro atu mātou rina ki te katoa, nau mai haere mai ki roki i te whare. Kia koutu te kauri hina. Hara mai, uru mai, ki roto i te whare, ki roto i tō tāmene, au. Haere mai. Pakatiti kōre, pakatiti whakāro. Uru tiwa, uru atua. Tēnā te umeri atu kia koutu nau mai haere.
he tino hono ki a mātu nei kia karani he te hui, kia mātu. Āhua whakaitia, tēnei, kāre mā te pākai ana ngā kai tutu o te kāinga. He tino whakamāte nā āhuatana, ai he ngā kai o te au, o tō mātu nei o āu, wai ui. Ai he. Koine te tino take, ka mate te wai tahi ara ko te wai o koine, kai rakimuri, ka mate te wai o te tangata. Kātahi, haere mai. Me pakapakani me hānai kātua he mao anō, kia ora i te katoa. Kātahi anō ngā mihi, ka hura te kia koe i jiu, mā haure kapinge. E kau.
Te oro papa, kai te himene tuatahi mo tēnei, he honore he krori. He honore he kroria, mga rogo ki te whenua, whakaro, paie, ki ngā tangata katoa, ake amine, te atua, te piringa, tōku oranga, tōku oranga. Ai honore he kroria, he maungarongo, he pakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Amen. Ai tō mātou maki te rangi, kei te tūmai ki tēnei tō pōnu no te aro mo tēnei wā. He whakamoe me te, he whakamike, he whakawātea o tēnei te timatatanga o ngā hui, ko kapi mo tēnei wā. Nā ki tanga mo tēnei te manuhiri, ka whakahoki o rātou kāinga. Nā ki tanga i ngā waka he runga te huarahi, he pai haere, he whakahoki mo tēnei wā. Nā ki tanga ki te hau kāinga, kei te api he teki mo tēnei rātou, ko tā mai ki runga mo tēnei te hui. No re pā ki runga ki a koe, tō wairua, tō manakitanga. Kei te māwiwitanga e ngā kaumātua, e ngā pakeke, tamariki, mokopuna hoki, kei roto te hoi pero te kāinga, piki te kā, piki te ora, piki te mārumatanga e pā. Ke rātau e noho i te kapua pauri, kei ngā pani e noho mo tēnei hea kāinga, kei roto e nā te kahununu iwi, mai atu te Aotearoa. Kei tō manakitanga ki a rātau. No re pā ki runga ki a koe, tō manakitanga, tō wairo i ngā wā katoa. Ko kapi mo tēnei te hui, ki a tau, ki a tātou katoa.
Te whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, ne te aroha ki a atua, ne te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, amen.
Tūturu whakamau ki a tīna.
Tīna!
Hui e.
Tai ki e.
Kia ora papa.
Kia ora, come on, Jerry.